Dr. Nadilia is a professor in the, and she works in the University of Exeter and the College of Oriental Studies in the University of London. She is specialized in the Gulf and the Arab region and has published on urban history. 2 years ago, her book on Minamana since 1800 was translated and it is available. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdulrahman. Thank you for this introduction and for your hospitality. I will.
Only this one.
So my إذا محاضرتي ستكون باللغة العربية واعتذاري للحضور واعتذاري للحاضرين. إذا وطبعا أشكر الذين حضروا في هذا الوقت المبكر للاستماع لي ولياسر. أعتقد أنه في البداية.
Tell you that I want to, in some ways, I want to place myself and my involvement with Gulf studies and the Gulf cities in my own, in the context of my personal trajectory as an historian of the Middle East and as an area studies person. Now, I was trained in Italy and in the UK and worked in the UK and in the American system now at NYU Abu Dhabi all my life. So my own training has been very much informed first by what, can be called Orientalist study, Oriental studies. I studied in Venice and I studied classical Arabic in Venice. And then informed by what, in the Anglophone world is called area studies. And the area studies I was involved in was Middle Eastern studies. I worked not only on the Arab world, but also on Kurds in Iraq and so forth. So now, so this to make you understand where I come from. And when I was briefed for this presentation, for this keynote, I was basically asked to highlight the importance of the study of Gulf cities for global research and to sort of try to discuss how the study of Gulf cities in the last, let's say, 30, 40, well, sort of 20, 30 years, has kind of benefited the Gulf studies research agenda. Because where I come from, meaning the Anglophone academia primarily, Gulf studies has been constituted as an area study unit. Meaning an area studies, let's say a sub-area studies unit, because, you have the idea of Arab studies, Middle Eastern studies, and Gulf studies notionally used to sit within Arab and Middle Eastern studies. So I've long argued against the exceptionalism of Gulf and its cities, a trope that in many respects for long marginalized their study, particularly in the humanities, but also in some of the branches of the social sciences, both in relation to the Arab region and far beyond. For long, the Gulf was typecast as an academic periphery. No longer, though, following this area study logic, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that, because of the ways in which Oriental studies and area studies developed in Western academia since the end of the Second World War. An area of academic engagement that, for the sake of brevity and clarity, I have called Westernism in the title of my presentation. For me, actually, arguing against exceptionally meant at the time when I started working on the Gulf region and on its cities, and I'm talking here about a long time ago, mid-1990s, meant placing the Gulf on the academic agenda of area studies first, because I mean, you know, I have a number of wonderful stories to tell you, but when my PhD was on Iraq, and when I decided to start working on the Gulf region, and particularly on Bahrain, actually, because that was the early work I did, many of my colleagues would tell me, oh my God, what are you doing? Are you, as an historian, you're working on Gulf cities or on the Gulf? This was a no-brainer, I mean, kind of a recipe for failure, for career failure, which hasn't been actually, but just to tell you the kind of attitude that it was there. So there is this notion of Westernism and the ways in which area studies, Gulf studies, Arab studies, Middle Eastern studies has been constructed. In parallel, however, and naturally, of course, the region has been approached through the prism of Arabism, what I shall call Arabism. Now, clearly, and I'm an historian, and I'm looking at it historically, the project, the political project, and yeah, we are talking about political projects here in the same way as the Western area studies as a political project. The political project of Pan-Arabism since Jamal Abdel Nasser Day have been an important incentive for this approach, of course, as well as the British withdrawal from the Gulf region in the early 1970s, and also the formation of the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981. Of course, these were key moments for the building of national and regional identities. And we've been talking about national and regional identities yesterday quite a bit. I mean, they've been touched upon in the various papers. While what I should call the Arabist approach has had many strong merits, and I don't need to tell you what are the strong merits. Of course, I mean, this approach is reflective of the identity of the Gulf citizens' population and feeling of cultural belonging that all this population have. But, however, this approach has had, in terms of the studying of the region, some shortcomings. Now, for me, in fact, it contributed in the past to strengthen the idea of Gulf cities as lesser cities, as minor cities historically. Why? Less worthy of study and research than, let us say, the great Arab cities of the Arab civilization, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and so forth, which, of course, and Cairo in particular, in the 1950s, during the Nasserid period, became really a very important center of Pan-Arabism. So, in some respect, though, this was also reflective of the attitude of many scholars brought up in a European Orientalist tradition that basically became very engaged with the idea of an Islamic city, right? Orientalist scholarship has been thriving in the past on the idea of an Islamic city. And this trend of studies, I mean, looking at Gulf cities, trying to recuperate an Arab-Islamic identity was very, very prevalent in the 1980s. And not only by few, I have to say, European or Western scholars, but by a lot of Arab architects in particular, but also town planners and so forth. And when I started working on looking at the literature on Gulf cities in the mid-1990s, I just found a lot of this literature. So it was really kind of a prevalent approach. Of course, and that's another issue that I would like to highlight, looking at Gulf cities through the prism of Arabism, or what I term the Arabist approach, also ignited a fierce historical debate and contestation about the ethnic identity of some of the regional centers along the Gulf Coast that were historically, and still are in many ways, if you look at the population, composition of the population, cosmopolitan. And I'm talking here, of course, about Kuwait City, Manama, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and so forth. Now, and these were actually historically, and I approach first them as an historian, kind of cosmopolitan port cities that had a lot of links to the Indian Ocean world. So they had a lot of links to Iran historically, to India, even the Far East, and so forth. Now, and these were kind of economic links, but they were also demographic and other type of links, and this is obviously well documented. Now, so there is this idea of this historical debate, but also contemporary debate. What is the character of the Gulf cities? An Arab city, I mean, I'm not that interested in giving labels, but I'm just saying this is these are the terms of the debate. And, or are they cosmopolitan cities? And if we say cosmopolitan, are we offending the Arab residents? And if we say Arab, are we kind of not taking into consideration the non-Arab population that live here? They are not citizens, but they live here. So the ways in which I've tried to navigate Gulf exceptionalism, and this has been a kind of a life enterprise, which obviously I'm very happy because now there is no more exceptional. I think it's been accepted that the Gulf is not exceptional. And also the periphery syndrome of this region was initially to study the history of port cities. That's how I started off before and after the discovery of oil, by highlighting their connectivities with the Arab, Iranian, and Indian Oceans and beyond worlds, and more generally, the global worlds of empire. Right? Because if you look at a place like Bahrain, it was the center of a British empire in the Gulf for a number of years, as many Bahrainis know are here, and therefore the world of empires, you can think of Manama, for instance, as an imperial city as well, in the same way as many other cities along the Indian Ocean rim, and so forth. Another ways in which I've tried to escape, or I tried to escape in the past, this whole idea of exceptionalism was, and the periphery syndrome that, in a sense, beset this part of the world, the study of this part of the world. I also try to emphasize historical continuities, and for me was very interesting and was very important to look at processes of modernization in context, and so forth. Of course, I was actually helped by the fact that Bahrain perhaps has a bit of a different history of modernization before actually oil exploitation and so forth, but I think this was a perspective that I wanted to emphasize. And also, and this reminds me of a presentation by Saud, I don't know whether he's here yesterday, on space, because I started to write in the early to work on it in the mid-late 1990s, I was very much influenced by the spatial turn. And so I started, and there was this kind of use of space as an analytical device, as an analytical concept that very much became a la mode in the 1990s in order to study cities, societies, cultures, and so forth. And so this spatial approach for me was actually very, very important. And I'm very happy that this is continuing in the study of the urban in the region on an urban project. More recently, and inevitably actually, as an historian working on, and since 2017, living in the Gulf region, as I live now in Abu Dhabi, I became involved with oil. In many respects, my work on cities, from an initial spatial kind of bent, has turned material. And I will explain what I mean with material as I'm looking at the making of Gulf cities and societies now, and this is the kind of idea I've been working on from some times, and culture through the material politics of oil. Oil is one of my great interests, and I'm looking at the material politics of oil as both as a substance, as an industry. And of course, we can't avoid talking about oil, although, we are entering, of course, the post-oil era, I mean, the world is all getting a bit upside down, but for a long time, oil was very, very central to what happened to this region. And, you know, my own work goes from the 1930s to the 1970s, I mean, until the oil crisis of 1973, so the period before the nationalization of the industry. Let me explain what I mean with material. Now, not the classic political economy sense of wealth, class, and capital accumulation that is a kind of a, you know, comes out of a sort of a Marxist analysis, but more in the sense of the material worlds brought about by the urban revolution triggered by oil. I'm very interested in objects, you know, a new object and the circulation of objects from publications, cars, consumer items, fridges. I'm very interested in oil derivatives and the ways they were used in building up the city and they were actually perceived by the population. And I'm talking here about plastic, tar for roads and so forth. I'm also interested in the way in which the early modern Gulf city, and I'm using Gulf city in a very essentialist sense, I don't like it, but just, you know, I'm focusing on a number of different places. I'm also looking at the ways in which modern technology, expertise, and urban civil infrastructure worked and affected people's lives, like electricity grids, water piping, and so forth. This can all be linked to the energy revolution brought about by oil, I mean, and so forth. I'm also very interested in this idea of urban experience, because I think in some ways we are talking a lot about city as structures and as agents, but I think we need to kind of perhaps, and many anthropologists have worked on this, on the Gulf cities in terms of, in experiential terms, working on the experience of individuals, of citizens, residents, and so forth. But I think historically also it's very important to look at it. The ways in which the society and individuals and community experience this change. Now, the other interesting thing that for me, I think it's, and this is an idea that I got by looking at a lot of stuff, of work done not on the Middle East, but on energy around the world, energy broadly speaking, oil, gas, and so forth, is the idea of visibility and invisibility. Now, oil is that kind of substance that we really don't see much. We see the derivatives, we see the wealth, we think of it as wealth, but sometimes it escapes kind of our vision. And actually, this is the cover of the last edited the last volume edited with my colleague Mandana Limbert, and actually this talks about basically oil's experiences in the Middle East, experiences in everyday life. And as you can see from the subtitle, is a collaboration between historians and anthropology. And this book aims at exposing oil in whatever form, as a substance, as an industry, and so forth. And there are some very interesting things that come out of the research conducted by my colleagues for this edited volume. Now, I just wanted to highlight this notion of visibility and invisibility of oil in this region. This is a bottle of oil, which is a bottle of crude oil, as you can see on the right-hand side, which is exhibited in Qasr Al Hosn in central Abu Dhabi. Also, I mean, this is the caption, which I'll read out. Sheikh Salama bin Butti followed early oil exploration very closely. So we are here, this is an historical museum, and so it recounts early oil discovery in the Emirates, which obviously came later than here. One account relates that she took a bottle of crude oil to her son, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan al Nahyan, the former ruler of Abu Dhabi, in Al Ain, so that he could know what it looked like. Despite the fact the world relies on it, most people have never seen crude oil for themselves. So this is the idea that oil was kind of this sort of magical, invisible substance for many people living in the region. And I just want to make you understand this invisibility by looking at the opposite. This is Baku in Azerbaijan, a city that I partly studied because I like to study comparatively, very connectedly, this oil city. Of course, Baku is the oldest oil city in the world. And there is a total difference between oil, the ways in which oil is lived and experienced historically in Azerbaijan than in the Gulf, because oil seepage, bitumen, was everywhere since time immemorial. And this is the center of Baku. And this is the so-called parachute tower, one of the main symbols of the city, which is an oil rig. So in a sense, the oil industry has become part of heritage culture of Azerbaijan as a nation. And this was built, by the way, in 1936, and is one of the main tourist attractions in the city. So there is this idea also of urban spaces, monuments, leisure and tourism here with oil in Baku. They've been discussing for Doha and the Gulf with a different project, but oil has not entered the sphere in the Gulf. But I think perhaps they could enter this sphere because that's what I've noticed, that recently the early material cultures of oil have re-entered or entered for the first time, let's say, the life of some Gulf cities, resurfacing as museum displays. Used to celebrate the beginning of the oil industry in different countries. And perhaps this is an emerging heritage cottage industry, let's say, representative of a new type of soft power emanated by cultural and national institution. And we've talked about nation building and all the rest in relation to a certain type of heritage, to wrath, nostalgia, and so forth. Or folklore. So this is an interesting example, and this is from Qatar National Museum, which I visit, well, I think it was a year ago, and I hope this is still there. I mean, I'm sure it is. So this is the room that celebrated the early oil development in Qatar, and you can see there a car, spare parts, bicycles, alongside, of course, TVs and very other. Also, there is a Singer sewing machine, along other kind of objects. Now, indeed, one of the main issues of oil present in urban life can be located in the affect and effects of oil mobility and automobility. So, movement and the ways in which cities were planned around this movement, cars particularly, and so forth. Let's not forget that cars are the main, one of the main mechanical objects, oil objects, moved by oil, by petrol, I mean, you know, and so forth. And so there is this kind of idea of mobility shaping, all mobility through cars and so forth, but also in some ways to airplanes, and this is another part of my shaping the life of Gulf cities. cars. Obviously, this is a photo from Bahrain in the 1950s where, you know, the Manama was already, you know, you had quite a lot of cars moving around. And also this, I think, is another display in the Qatar National Museum that, you know, shows typewriters, clock, telephones, communication, and, you know, highlighting the ways in which new modes of public communication came to be very, very important in the early oil era. And also, what is very interesting, a new corporate culture which was brought in by the oil industry. A corporate culture that also, and you know, I got really fascinated by clocks, the old clocks that you found in the office that really started to measure time in a very different ways, you know, what we would now call clock in, clock out. I have only, I guess, a couple of minutes. I had a much longer paper. As usual, I always write too much. One thing I wanted to say in what is left now is that I was asked once, perhaps a year and a half ago, to do a bit of research on Gulf studies, right? Where Gulf studies as area studies started to be formed in some ways as a discipline and so forth. You know, what I actually realized is that there is a very interesting story which involves actually partly the University of Exeter, where I used, in the UK, where I used to work and where Abdulrahman got his PhD and where many other were. Basically, it's interesting because on the one hand, let's say in the late 1970s, you have an early 1980s, you have the University of Exeter, a Western institution that start developing this Center for Gulf Studies, which I think it was the first, which had colonial connection, by the way, because the founders were all kind of ex-Foreign Office guys who were ruling the Gulf before 1971. But also the Center for Arab Gulf Studies of Basra University. Right? And this is actually was an interesting story. So you have basically two political projects there intersecting. And I'm thinking about the late 1970s. So you have before the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war. So you have fundamentally, you have the Ba'ath regime and the Center for Arab Gulf Studies, for Gulf Studies of Basra University were very much under, you know, the control of the Ba'ath regime. And on the other hand, you had an academic political project which was actually established by former British official. So just to say that area studies is an area of academic engagement, but also political one. And in some ways, this concept of Arabism and Westernism somehow, in this particular beginning of Gulf studies, coincided.
That is 2 minutes if you would like to.
Oh wow. Sorry, I didn't want to take too much. Now, another thing that perhaps, as I have 2 minutes, going back to the Gulf city, I mean, I think that the whole idea of Gulf city and the study of Gulf cities, of cities in the Gulf, of urban environment, of urban culture and urban society, has been actually very important to open up not only Gulf studies or the study of the Gulf region to other areas. I mean, and I'm thinking about India Ocean world, Southeast Asia, Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and so forth, because this is what is happening more and more, that in a sense, Gulf cities are considered to be hinges, connectors between different regions because of their demographies and so forth. But the study of Gulf cities has also helped, that this is actually quite important, going back to the area studies I started discussing Arab studies and Middle Eastern studies, has actually helped to democratize Arab and Middle Eastern studies in some ways, what I call democratize, in a sense that I can see that there is a lot, there is a lot of research being done by very young academics on the Gulf, both Arab, non-Arab, Western, and whatever, but also coming from the Indian subcontinent, that has been really very much in conversation with work being done on other parts of the Arab world, or Turkey, or the Middle East, and so forth. So I feel we are at a point now where Gulf studies, this area studies that, in some ways I really problematize, but I have to use the term, is kind of really has moved forward a lot, and has also helped other areas of research, and is helping, and is kind of being quite taqadumi in some ways, in promoting new type and innovative research.
Thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا للدكتورة نليدا وأعتذر.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nelida. I would like to apologize for the shortness of time because it was determined that every intervention would be just 30 minutes. Now we move on to Dr. Yasser Elsheshtawy, who will be speaking to us about transience and temporality in Arab Gulf cities. Dr. Yasser is an associate professor in architecture in Columbia University in the graduate studies college. He has a doctorate in architecture from Wisconsin University in the United States of America, and he's also a member of the consultative body in the university in Riyadh. So if anyone wants to read up on his publications, you can refer to them in the reference guide that we have provided you with. Thank you, Dr. Abdulrahman, for this introduction. سأتحدث خلال هذه المحاضرة عن العابرية والزمنية في مدن دبي وأبو ظبي. أنا مهتم جدا بهذا الموضوع نظرا لأنني عشت وعملت في الخليج وبشكل خاص في الإمارات لمدة 20 عام تقريبا، وأغلبية مسيرتي المهنية كانت في هذه المنطقة.
Or that it is a place that I would like to call home. Transience and temporariness pervades every aspect of life, every moment, every encounter in these marvels of modernity comprised of gleaming glass towers. The whole city seems like a perpetual construction site. As an architect, someone whose concern is the built environment, I was very much interested in the physical manifestation of this. What does transience look like? Does it have a look or a shape or a form? Or is it just a feeling? I took these scenes, these photographs in 2017. These were my last days in the city. They have a sort of wistful quality, an ode, but also a condemnation in many ways. Of course, not everything was transient. As I was conducting research in the various spaces of the cities of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, I found that there is a resistance of sorts. For example, by occupying a sidewalk, or by discovering an alleyway where migrants are hanging clothes on a clothesline, and in the back is a shop owner working on blankets that were placed in the middle of the alley. Or we can find people hanging out in a parking lot in Abu Dhabi in front of an abandoned building which at that time was slated for demolition. And in fact, this building was used as a community hub for the Bangladeshi residents who lived in that area. Or a shoe repair shop in a side alley in Dubai, the owner asserting his right to the city, and in the midst of signs of resistance, such as graffiti or a profane graffiti. So people try to set down roots, to establish a home, to inhabit the city, to dwell, to use a Heideggerian term. But that does not always work. There is a sense of precariousness, an attempt to render the disadvantaged invisible, and their only recourse is a hastily written statement on a low-income building in Dubai, which also was slated for demolition. And seeing all that, the one quality, the one condition that seemed to me to explain all that was transience. And I wasn't just the only one who felt that way. There were many others who expressed similar sentiments at the time. Deepak Unikrishnan wrote Temporary People, a harsh indictment about the transience of Abu Dhabi. Andre Nafis Saheli, a poet and another former Abu Dhabi resident, described the conditions of imported workers. In a powerful poem titled Vanishing Act, he portrays the return of the dead. Only 2 out of 10 people die in Abu Dhabi. The rest simply fail to have their visas renewed. They are bagged, tagged, and placed on the next available flight back to wherever they came from. The one-way ticket experience par excellence. Every edifice on this island is crafted by these almost nothings. Their solace in death, at least, is to never again queue for whole days on end to have their fingertips inked and pressed by intolerant hands, their blood screened for undesirable illnesses, their flesh seared by a sun that wonders what the hell they are doing there. These are harsh words reflecting a sense of injustice, and the only recourse for those who are left behind is leaving traces of their existence and their temporary lives, as we see in these informal ads on walls and lampposts advertising bed space and shared accommodations. I have in my years in the UAE studied these communities, walked in their midst, trying to understand how they create a sense of community, but also in many ways attempting to understand my own sense of transience and lack of belonging. Being there made me aware of my precarious existence as well. So following all of that, and after having returned to the United States in 2017, I decided to write a book about these issues. And both the front cover and the images on the front cover and the back cover are reflective of these 2 qualities, temporariness and connection. The front cover shows a development in Dubai called City Walk. And in the back, we see the Burj Khalifa. And that development could be anywhere. It could be Hong Kong, Singapore, the United States. And we see residents, tourists, visitors inhabiting these spaces and similar to everybody else, are probably as alienated and wondering about the identity of that place. Or the other quality, the connection and the attempt to establish some sense of permanence, can be seen actually right next to this development in the district of Satwa. This is a photograph by a good friend of mine, the Milanese photographer Michele Nastasi, showing Pakistani workers playing cricket in an empty site, which is something very common throughout the Gulf. So my talk will be in two parts. First, I will try to construct this landscape of transience through a photo essay to capture this transient quality through the built environment. And the key question is, what does transience look like? And at the same time, I will also try to show what forms of resistance have emerged towards such precarious conditions. And first, I would like to start with this image here, which shows the city of Dubai from a distance. It's a much used depiction, the city rising from the desert, appearing like a fragile metropolis. In other areas, one gets a sense that it is something one isn't really a part of. It is a city that is perpetually under construction, unfinished. There is a sense of incompleteness. And of course, we always find those construction workers toiling away, which further adds and intensifies this feeling. The transient city is uncanny. There is a sense of spookiness, as we see here in an image of International City, which is a district that was meant to contain affordable housing. This was in the very early stages of its construction. Now it has turned into a kind of slum, actually a very dangerous area inhabited by gangs. But at that time, it was devoid of life. There was an otherworldly quality. And one always wonders about the presence of people. So this is the landscape of transience. But there is, of course, also another side, one of resistance. It is one where migrants leave behind traces marking their presence. A place where they claim their presence and assert their belonging through informal acts, such as this informal mosque that was constructed by a shopkeeper in the back, an Egyptian who owns a furniture store, who built this mosque for people in this neighborhood without any permission from the municipality, but was nevertheless tolerated, and it's a place that people were using. In other parts of Abu Dhabi, we see people coming together as a group in street corners and on grass lawns. It is sort of a collective occupation of the city. In other sections, they are trying to set down roots, such as this informal garden, by removing sidewalk tiles. And of course, walking. The sheer act of moving in the city enables those migrants to write their own story, inscribe it on the city's streets, as French urban sociologist Marc Auger has argued. The second part of my talk is comprised of case studies, examples on how people have resisted this sense of transience and temporality. And I've conceptualized it as a set of spatial strategies. The first one is quotidian space, spaces of the everyday, which is how everyday interactions enable a sense of normalcy and establishing a home of sorts. And to that end, I looked at the district neighborhood of Hor Al Anz in Dubai, in the Deira section of the city bordering Sharjah. And I looked at a specific street called Hor Al Anz Street. And this is a neighborhood that used to be populated by Emirati nationals, but as is common in the 90s and the 2000s, they moved into the suburbs and South Asian migrants moved in. And my interest in this area and this street in particular was looking at specific behavioral events and interactions and how the street is used as a living room, a residential space, a semi-home. So we see people talking on sidewalks, and it's all quite informal. They are wearing the South Asian undergarment called lungi, which is something that they wouldn't be able to do in the more formal parts of the city. On the sidewalk, people are meeting friends, exchanging news. There are numerous activities taking place on the street. And in a side alley, we see people who live in these apartments, and there could be like 50, 60 people living in these units. They step outside, talk to their friends and family back home, and the sidewalk or this outdoor space becomes an extension of their living space as well. And one particular street corner was quite heavily used and occupied my attention, and I named it Peshawar Street Corner after a restaurant occupying a prominent spot in that locale. And I studied this section quite extensively, and we can see people going in and out, watching cricket through the window. It's really a very vibrant setting, and is sort of a counterpoint to the cliched image we have of Dubai. The second spatial strategy I described as sheltering space, or a space that allows migrants to come together away from the control of authorities. And here I focused on Abu Dhabi and on a particular locale in Abu Dhabi, which I have called the square with a tree. And here is a close-up view of that section. So this is in downtown Abu Dhabi, close to the Cultural Foundation and Qasr al-Hosn, the fort, and the World Trade Center. And if you step inside that block and under that red dot is that square with a tree. And that square was really fascinating because it's basically, as I discovered, was a center for the Bangladeshi community in Abu Dhabi. And that tree acted as an anchor of sorts, drawing people into that space. And I discovered this area in 2011, and then as part of a larger research project in 2014, spent around a month studying this space and looking at the various interactions that take place there. And the surroundings or the shops were mostly restaurants serving ethnic food. Chairs and tables were placed on the outside, and in defiance of municipal regulations, but it was nevertheless sort of tolerated. And I did a lot of behavioral mapping and looked at specific behavioral events and the activities that take place across the entire day, and it really was a center for people from Bangladesh. There's a commercial area nearby, so they would buy blankets and things like that to take back home. And it wasn't just the Bangladeshi people. They would come from all parts of the city, but also the residents who lived in the apartments overlooking this square. In the evening, around 10 p.m., when everybody leaves, they come down, and the children and teenagers start playing soccer in that square. The third spatial strategy I have described as cosmopolitan space. These are sites where different groups of migrants come together. And here I looked at the city of Dubai in particular, and an area or a space called Nasser Square or Baniyas Square. And it is a space representative of what sociologist Elijah Anderson described as a cosmopolitan canopy, which is a setting where groups, while being in each other's physical presence, do not interact, but they tend to form separate groups. And at the margin of such sites, they engage in actions that subvert attempts at control. So it's under this red dot right here in the area in Deira in Dubai. And this is a close-up view of Beniya Square. It's sort of an elongated urban setting. There is a metro station there, underground metro station. And the space in front of the station is kind of like a stage. Everyone is very carefully positioned, and it also serves as a commercial function. But the square seems to have transcended its commercial or leisure function to become a site of refuge, a shelter, and a meeting place. We see people, different nationalities, Arabs, Indians, locals, tourists from the Gulf. They all come together here. On the left is a young couple talking to each other, and on the right, an elderly couple, possibly from Iran, resting on the lawn, and others are hanging out with friends. It is a park-like atmosphere. And unlike other settings and spaces in Dubai, there are also sections where there are women that sit together, and there's also a part where there is a family and Chinese families from China with their children that utilize this space as well. Finally, I was not just focused on migrants, but also on Emirati nationals, residents, who have found a way through their old Shabi homes. These were residences given by the government to low-income citizens, and which they have transformed in innumerable ways to assert their sense of belonging and connection to the land. And this was part of a larger research project where I was appointed as the curator for the UAE National Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2016. And part of our research was trying to look at the origins of these houses. And this is an image by a Dutch photographer taken in the 70s, which shows camels in the foreground, and then in the middle are temporary huts where Bedouins were staying in anticipation of moving to these newly constructed homes that we see in the back. And these homes were initially quite simple in their configuration. They were designed by Western architects, British architects. It was a courtyard complex, blank walls, and they all looked the same. That typology evolved over the years, and there were many variations on that specific configuration. This is one of them, and they always invariably involved bedrooms, toilets, an outdoor area, a majlis, which we see on the lower left, and the kitchen on the upper left. And the kitchen was originally attached to the house, but then residents complained because of the smell and so on, so they moved the kitchen away, but also because these kitchens were operated by maids and others, service workers from South Asia. Now, the interesting thing about these houses and the connection to this sort of resistance to temporality and transience is that residents individualized these homes. They made additions, they changed them, they changed the door, they painted them in different colors so that they are distinguishable from one house to the next. And we see that till this day. This is one example of a Shabi house that was located in Liwa Oasis, which is the southern section of the UAE overlooking the empty quarter and Saudi Arabia. And what is so fascinating is not just the additions and changes that residents made, but also the landscaping that reached the extent where these houses were hidden by this green foliage. This is a Shabi neighborhood in the city of Al Ain where I lived, and we see to the right a very small sort of appearance of a Shabi house, but then the other homes are hidden behind this landscaping. We also spoke to residents of some of these homes, and some of them showed us their family album. And this is Al-Miqbali, who was the father of one of my students at UAE University. And we see him inside his shabby home here, tending to the garden. And it's a way to establish permanence, because these homes were meant to be temporary. And eventually, many of the Emiratis actually moved out to larger villas and so on. But some remained and stayed behind, particularly the elderly. This was one woman that I would pass by. I lived in this neighborhood, but in the university housing development. But I would pass by on my way to work, and I would see this woman in the winter months sitting in front of her home. And I was really curious about her story, and I asked one of the photographers that we collaborated with, Reem Falaknaz, to come to that home and speak to her and take her photograph. And she told her that she likes to sit outside just to enjoy the sun during the winter months. Her husband passed away, as well as her only son, but she has a large extended family, and they come and visit her on weekends. And in Dubai, there is this neighborhood called Sha'biyat al-Shorta, the police neighborhood. And this neighborhood was demolished and replaced with the City Walk development that I showed at the beginning of my talk. And in 2014, right before that neighborhood was slated for demolition, I went there with one of my PhD students, and we walked in that neighborhood and talked to different people there. And one house caught our attention, which you see right here. It's basically a giant garden. The house is hidden behind this. And this neighborhood had existed for since the 70s, so it was there for more than 2 decades. We spoke to the owner of this home, and he told us that he lives there with his family as well as his mother, and it's actually his mother who tends to this garden. And they were scheduled to leave that home within a few months. And he told us that his mother gets up every morning, waters the garden, and the neighbors tell her, like, why do you keep doing this? You're going to leave anyway. And she told them that she has been doing this for decades, and she will keep doing this till the day she leaves. And this showed to us that in spite of that sense of temporariness and transience, whether you are a migrant or a national, you still are trying to connect to the land and to establish a sense of rootedness and connection. So this brings me to the last part of my talk, which is transience and Gulf exceptionalism. And is transience the sole purview of the Arab Gulf? Of course it is not. Transience is all around us. It's everywhere. But in the Gulf, to borrow a term my colleagues Harvey Moloch and Davide Ponzini used, it is not exceptional, but extreme. Transience is its sole mode of existence. But there are others who disagree. Omar al-Shahabi, a Bahraini scholar, talks about importing people to populate and animate the various mega projects that are being developed all across the region. He is in fact emphatic about the region's exceptionality and that this is unprecedented. Irrespective where one stands on this, and I myself, I'm quite conflicted on this, it makes for a precarious situation. Demographics, land use policies, and of course climate all contribute to this. Indeed, by looking at some developments, they are proceeding as if climate change, for example, does not exist. There is an endless expansion into the desert. Lines are literally drawn in the sand. Abdulrahman Munif, Saudi writer, wrote Cities of Salt, Mudun al-Malh. And he was asked about why did he describe cities in the Gulf as cities of salt. And he said, when the waters come in, the first waves will dissolve the salt, and reduce these great glass cities to dust. In antiquity, as you know, many cities simply disappeared. It is possible to foresee the downfall of cities that are inhuman. With no means of livelihood, they won't survive. Now, we can argue about this, and any reasonable person would agree that Gulf cities are really going anywhere. They are there. There is some permanence there. But I think these words should give us some pause and to reflect on them. And I would like to end with this image right here. This is a worker in the wholesale vegetable market in Dubai. And he's from South Asia. He's leaning against a column, perhaps resting, reflecting on his presence in Dubai, perhaps thinking about his family. And what is so, I guess, tragic about this image is that these developments in the Gulf are really not geared towards people like him, even though the Gulf city would not exist in its current form without the efforts by these workers from South Asia, whether they work in wholesale markets or they are construction workers, etc. They are, for lack of a better term, invisible people. And thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا للدكتور ياسر على هذا العرض. نفتح باب الأسئلة.
Now we will open the floor to questions and comments for 15 minutes. Then we will take a 15 minutes break. So we'll take a question from the left, then center, then right. Two minutes max, please. شكرا جزيلا. سؤالي للدكتورة نديدة. طبعا كما تعرفين
Pisa. And in a time they were against the Muslims because of the Crusaders' attacks. Then they changed their minds to realize an important question among themselves. Are we merchant first or Christian first? And the rise and fall of those cities depended on that question itself. So do you see any similarity between the Gulf state cities and the Italian cities? And is there any similarity between the Gulf cities themselves to end up like the Italian cities? Thank you.
تفضل. بس ناخذ الدكتور ونرجع لك دكتور ابتهال اذا سمحتي. هني لو سمحتي.
Thank you very much. My question to Dr. Nelida, do you still consider the Arab world one world? Because I think now we are witnessing three Arab worlds, one in the Gulf, one in the Levant, and divided by Israel, and divided by the oil, and one in Africa. And they are very different Arab worlds. After the pan-Arab, I think we have plural Arab worlds, not only one. My other point is that did you study the impact of the Gulf cities on other countries like India? I think there is a big phenomenon in India, in Kerala especially, that most of the Arab money goes back there with architecture and urbanism and material stuff that creates another Gulf cities there. And they are known also in Egypt, the workers who come back from the Gulf with Gulf money, Fulus al-Khalij, and they build houses and they bring TVs and they change their house appliances, and they are known as the Gulf workers. So there are other Gulf cities in other parts of the world that I think worth studying. Thank you very much.
دكتور ابتهال إذا سمحت. إن شاء الله. دكتور ابتهال إذا سمحت.
Yes, thank you for both brilliant papers. Dr. Elsheshtawy, I particularly enjoyed your fascinating paper that brought the architectural to the psychological. And you talking about walking, inscribing stories on the streets reminded me of a previous MP in Kuwait, to the once Parliament of Kuwait, asking or requiring that we tax expats for the streets they walk on, and even to the air that they breathe. And so my question would be, if I am a conscientious person, architect, what would I do to make those cities less transient, a bit more merciful, and maybe inclusive? Thank you.
دكتور طلال نرجع لك السادة صالح إن شاء الله.
My question is for Dr. Fuccaro. I'd like to get your idea about the underpinnings of regional commonality when we talk about area studies. Proponents of the oceanic turn and Gulf studies would say that the Indian Ocean is somehow an organic category because it stems from centuries of trade and maritime interaction. Whereas people on the Arabist side would say, there are linguistic commonalities, there are religious ties, and perhaps also an undervalued caravan trade as well that also works in creating regional commonality. So what is there really actually an organic region, organic area to study, or is everything basically, in the end, a construction? Thank you.
أستاذة صالحة بعد تنتقل دكتورة أمل. ما شفناك دكتور إن شاء الله بعد النساء إن شاء الله. بس أنت يساري دكتور ما أنت يميني. يساري أنا يمين القاعة. الله يعطيك الصحة والعافية. تفضل يا أستاذ.
Hi. So my first question for the doctor, as you are living now in Abu Dhabi, I will understand that you are living in As'adiyat Island, right? So I want like to ask, how do you describe As'adiyat Island and the same like similar project, for example, Al Maria Islands, and sorts of like shaping new cities or new urban areas in Abu Dhabi, and similar, I think, in Dubai with those, new built isolated islands somehow, some way. And for Dr. Yasser, I would to add like one new sort of like locals and their resistance to the way of like they are moving from the city, from them, for example, a place to another place in the city. There is a very nice project created by an Emirati local. She don't like to mention her name, but the project is called Goodbye Old Jumeirah. And Goodbye Old Jumeirah.
Old Jumeirah.
And through that, she's going to the houses of Jumeirah that is now are like going to be demolished. And the new project of like Jumeirah streets nowadays is like to remove all the residential places to make them like restaurants and clinics and these. And she's like saying goodbye to those houses by like writing some sorts of sentences, like, the old street art. Until the house is demolished. And she's taking pictures of this and putting them on Instagram. And you can find it as Goodbye Old Jumeirah. And when you are going through these pictures, she's creating an lively archive of the houses of the locals that are going to be demolished with their memories. Sometimes you can visit those houses before going to be demolished, and we managed to visit some of these houses. And there is a very interesting thing that you will find some of the stuff of the people who already lived in those houses. Like they lived in an urgent way or something happened, but also these are their belongings. For example, one of the houses I visited, there was like a whole albums of the family who was living in this house with their memory and etc. And the funny thing, like when you see outside toward the street, like you are moving in a very, uninhabited house, for example, but you can see just in the opposite, like the very clear Burj Khalifa and big, buildings. It's a very, a unique picture of Dubai, I think, and the way like it's moving. But this is a very interesting project. I think you need to see. Thank you.
Thank you. انتقل إلى الدكتورة أمل بعد الدكتور محمد. سامحنا يا دكتور. شفتها إن شاء الله.
Thank you for both speakers. Nelida, I have some comments and maybe a question, we'll see. I'm grappling with similar questions you're trying to deal with here, especially in terms of the impact of area studies or the area study model on the Gulf, and for historians at least. I studied history in Beirut for 6 years and never encountered Gulf history. The Arabian Peninsula only featured in courses on early Islam. So being Arabist doesn't mean you'll actually include the Arabian Peninsula in your studies. I got introduced to Gulf history when I did African history and Indian Ocean history, which also tells you how much conceptually area studies is impacting our epistemology and our methodology when we want to treat an area like the Arabian Peninsula. So my question here, or not question, first, I'm looking forward to the conclusion you'll get in terms of when the area studies, Gulf studies and area studies emerged and how. But what I want to say here is, I think this is the issue here, is we keep thinking in terms of area studies, right? And I urge you to go back to the volume that was published in 2014 in comparative studies in Africa, South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. There was a special issue called the Indian Ocean and the other Middle Easts. And we've tried collectively to deal with this. Mandana has an article in that volume as well. So basically what I want to say here is we need to find other categories, other concepts, different from area studies in order, and we need to develop tools for that, right? Like myself, I do the network, right, to get out of the area studies model. So yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you. دكتور محمد إذا سمحت.
Despite the mode in this August hall today is English language. And I would prefer, so long I am in Arab country, also in the Arab Center for Research and Policy, I would
أنا أتكلم العربية دكتور. أنا كنت أتكلم العربية.
I will speak in Arabic. دكتور ياسر، اليوم أحزنتني كثير جدا.
Saddened by by your presentation, and my heart is full of fear from what I have seen in your presentation. This very depressive image comparing between two societies. Totally European society in an area that's called the Arab Gulf, and on the other side the depressing, very trenching image that you have showed the Arab people living in this very depressive context. We are at the end of December, and in the third committee of the United Nations that discusses the situation of migrants and immigrants and expats in the Gulf area and North Africa. All calls for the existential right to be treated as the area is their homeland. And in the United Nations, isn't there a rationale and wisdom among the Gulf leaders to recognize that the expats, especially those who does not speak Arabic, are that they are constituting the biggest risk in the coming 5 or to 10 years. We are in a huge dilemma, and this voting and the Social and Economic Council in Geneva is very much related to the concern that we have. The study says that more than between 17 to 20 million Asian in this region, and this constitutes a huge risk. So how can we come out of this dilemma, and how to emerge more optimistic? My apologies, there is no room for more questions, so I'll give five minutes to Dr. Nelida and 5 to Dr. Yasser. في البداية
States, well, I mean, I guess one could do a kind of comparative study in terms of this whole idea of these mercantile cities, port cities, and so forth. There are obviously similarities. There is a certain flexibility, pragmatism, and so forth, also in terms of cultural identities, mixity of languages, and so forth, and of people. I have to say, though, that thinking about the Italian city-states, and I'm no great expert of that, I mean, I think that the process of transition from city to state has been very, very different in the two regions. Whereas, you have the transition from a port city to a state capital in the Gulf, and I'm not thinking about this through broad categories because it's a very, very broad question you're asking. You have the transition between sort of port city, and then you have state capital here, whereas in Italy you have the transition from several city-states, to one national state, which is Italy. And so the kind of localism, local identity, which is called campanilismo, that remains in these former city-states, and the regional local identities are very, very strong. So it's one could think about a project like that. Arab world, one world. Oh my God. This is a good question. I mean, I don't think in this way. And actually in some ways also Talal question is kind of along these lines in some ways. I don't think in this way of kind of unities in the same way as I agree with Amal. Area studies is very problematic as a unit, as a geographically constructed unit, as I think that in some ways also for the purpose of scholarship, for analytical purpose, I think the Arab world is obviously not a unit at the moment, although there might be a sense of unity through language, culture, and so forth. But obviously, depends on what kind of perspective you're looking for. You can't really be essentialist. Politically, of course, it's very problematic. Okay, let's try to imagine on an urban level, right? On cities. Is there an Arab city in the Arab world? I mean, if we think along these lines, I mean, where does the Gulf city fits in it? So I don't think like this, and it's not to disrespect the sense of feeling of unity of Arabs that live in this region. I'm just thinking as what's the best instrument for me to analyze societies, culture, cities, and so forth. Transfer, yes. We are always talking about importing models, architectural models, social models, whatever. And obviously, this talk of importing is very important for me as an historian, because clearly, as we've seen yesterday, there was this plan of the first master plan of Kuwait City in the 50s or 60s by Spencer and Minopro, which was, that really was a clear, in that period, you really had a real colonial kind of import. The kind of idea of importing now, for me, I would kind of discuss it more as transfer, right? So there is a transfer, and in the context of this transfer, and I have written about this idea of transfer, technology, expertise, and whatever, I don't think as well that we should be bound by categories like Western or Arab at this point, because I think there is a high degree of, we live in a very different world, in a very globalized world. So I have not studied specifically ways in which the Gulf cities of Gulf urbanism has been spreading around, but I've seen it. Well, I know, for instance, I mean, just the shopping mall, the idea of shopping mall, right? This empire of consumerism is basically, if you think about many areas of the Arab world, Egypt, for instance, I think the idea of the shopping mall comes from this part of the world. Also, there have been in the 80s, and I'm sure you know, Yasser is probably much better equipped than me to respond to this, and the mega projects in Cairo have been partly inspired by what has been happening in Dubai. Downtown Beirut, the reconstruction as well. I mean, you know, so there is a lot. Also in Kerala, okay, in India, which is a country that I have, you know, I visited. In Kerala, for instance, you have Gulf-style villas along the canals, built with the remittances of, you know, of workers, of people who've worked in the Gulf. There is not kind of much, as far as I see, influence in more public architecture. I mean, if I've been to cities, well, except, of course, that all cities are the same these days, right? I mean, Saadiyat, well, I mean, the only thing I can say about Saadiyat, I could say a lot of things where I live, but I see it as an historical continuity of land reclamation, what's happening in Abu Dhabi with the development of new islands and the expansion of existing ones. Yeah, perhaps, Amal, we can discuss some more area studies, the two of us, but I agree with you. Trans paradigms have been very important. You use network in kind of overcoming these geographical barriers.
Thank you, Dr. Nelida. Yeah, I'll try to make this quick. So to the question about the first question was about Kuwait and the situation in Kuwait, and that there were some voices calling for taxing expatriates and perhaps even preventing them from using hospitals dedicated to Kuwaitis so they don't have to breathe the same air. And your question was about what to do and how to make cities less transient. This is obviously a very complicated question, and I'm working now on a research project in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where we are trying to define the urban identity of Riyadh. And part of our argument is that the presence of these migrant workers is an essential element of the city's identity, and they need to be taken into account in some way by upgrading these areas, by recognizing that they are an indispensable part of the city's urban fabric. And I'm talking from the perspective of an urbanist. The other comment was about the Goodbye Old Jumeirah initiative, and I wasn't aware of that, so thank you for mentioning this. But it reminded me of another initiative that took place in Abu Dhabi called Save the Cultural Foundation. A few years ago, that cultural foundation, a building from the 70s, a modernist building, was slated for demolition. And local Emiratis formed a Facebook group called Save the Cultural Foundation, and that caught the attention of the leadership in Abu Dhabi, including the wife of the late Sheikh Zayed. And they prevented the building from being demolished, and it is now part of a much larger complex, the Qasr al-Husn development, which is one of the nicest places in Abu Dhabi that you can visit. التعليق الأخير من الأخ وأنت تكلمت عن
دكتور مسافري. You said you were saddened and depressed by my presentations, and you spoke about the depressing localities and the non-Arab speaking and the risk they constitute to the area. At the end of the day, when I speak from architects and urbanists, and the role of the expats is a political decision related to the leaderships, and but from architect's perspective, I think the current situation cannot be sustained because it creates inequality and discrepancies in the cities, and we always call for the just city which is which accommodates everybody, and so as we always raise awareness to the problem and the risks associated with it. However, at the end of the day, the final saying is to the political leaderships in the, and I have nothing to do with that. I will suffice with it. I'd like to thank Dr. Nelida and Dr. Yasser. Thank you very much for your presence. We will take a 15-minute break, and we will